There it is. Click. And we're live. It is
Great.
Wednesday, December 30th, 2020, 5:03 p.m. We are 3 minutes late today because we did not sacrifice a yearling bull goat, sorry, to the crowdcast gods, and they retaliated against David Wessel, our guest. But as you all know, tech problems are part of the show on In Lieu of Fun. We relish them. We say, bring them on. And so we're here. There's only 24, there's only 22, I think 21 more days of the Trump presidency. There's only one more day of 2020. So things are looking up. But we are still not allowed to have fun anymore. And in lieu of fun, we have my Brookings colleague, David Wessel, who has defeated the attempted retaliation of the crowdcast gods. He has beaten them down, wrestled with an angel, and made it onto the show. David is the head of the Hutchins Center at Brookings, which is a little think tank within the think tank at the economic studies section, which focuses on fiscal policy and monetary policy. And so we thought it would be a great time to have him on to talk about the fiscal and economic mess that we are in, and how it is interrelated with COVID, and how a incoming administration would even want to think about it. And so, David, welcome to the show.
Oh, good to be with you.
So let's start with, we're going to have 20 and a bit more days before the new administration takes office. The president has now signed enough the latest relief package, but by most accounts, it's way too small, or by many accounts, it's way too small. So first of all, do you share that consensus? And to what extent do you think the first item of business for a Biden administration, other than, putting needles in the arms of as many people as possible, is going to be some additional degree of fiscal stimulus?
Well, I think that putting needles into the arms of as many people as possible is probably the most important thing that Biden can do to get the economy moving faster. So it's hard to separate them. It's definitely not big enough to get us back to the path we were on. I think there's a good debate to be had about whether this $2,000 per adult issue is really economically the right way to go, or whether it's become a political football. But I think it'll be interesting. I don't think that the Biden people will have an easy time getting conventional stimulus checks to people and some kind of payroll tax cut or whatever you want to do in a conventional Keynesian sense. And I suspect what they'll do, and what makes sense to me, is to try and direct the money to the things that really need the help. That is, shore up the state health department, shore up state and local governments, figuring out how we can fix our unemployment insurance system. These things that are more like investments and a little less like putting money in people's pockets. So I think that's what they'll probably try to do. As you know, they're going to have a hard time with the Senate. Even if they win the Georgia seats, it's going to be very hard to get any kind of big thing through, which is why I think the Biden people were pushing so hard. Please, let's have $900 billion now, because that can go on Trump's receipt, and don't make us come in and spend our political capital on that.
So what, when you said to get us back on track, we're back on the track that we were on, do you mean before COVID, or do you mean before the PPP lapsed and
No,
was not? was not sort of renewed in a timely fashion.
I mean, before COVID. I mean, if you take a simple line of what the economy was doing, we had this huge downtick. What do we have to do not only to be growing, which we appear to be doing now, but to get back on the path we were on? You know, our colleagues Louise Shaner and Wendy Edelberg figure that the $900 billion is about half of what you need to get back on the pre-pandemic growth path. So that's what we should do. How you do that, what the composition is worth thinking about, because it may not be that $2,000 checks to people, some of whom probably don't need the money, is the right way to go.
So that's interesting, because I remember really specifically at the beginning of the pandemic, Jason Furman, I think, was doing an interview on NPR. Jason Furman being at the Harvard Kennedy School, professor of economic policy, and I think he was the economic advisor to President Obama. I know you probably know that, but just for everyone else. But he was saying at the time that the first stimulus checks were too small, and that they were that was the single best way to kind of counteract the negative influence, like the drop in consumer confidence, the drop in kind of just literal human velocity of people going out and spending money. And so is it that time has passed now? Is it that there has been a normalization of this period? It's that it's stretched on so long. How has everything changed from that first quarter, or even let's say half?
Or was he wrong then?
No,
exactly.
No, I don't. One of the stories that will be written about this period is this is a huge success of fiscal and monetary policy. It's hard to believe that it could have been worse. But when Jason Furman was writing that, and in the second quarter of this year, people really were afraid, thoughtful people, not doomsayers, that we were in for a prolonged Great Depression-like conditions. And so we that didn't happen, in part because we put a lot of money in people's pockets so they can spend it. So time has passed, and what do we know? Well, one thing we know is that the worst case scenarios economically didn't come true, even though the virus is devastating. The unemployment rate is lower now than people thought it would be when they were making projections in March. Consumer spending on things like cars and houses, these are average, of course, doesn't apply to everybody, are better. So that it solved the problem. I don't think there's any question that another round of checks to people is a good idea. I think everybody, well, not everybody, there was good reason to do the $600. It's just that if you told me you have $463 billion to spend, would I spend that on topping up these checks to $2,000? Or would I spend it on something that I think is more targeted on people who really need it, and on things that I think can make the economy heal faster? And I'd go for those.
So explain why the economic reaction was not as bad as people believed it would be. I look at this situation and I say, if you could sketch out the disease impact was worse than people expected it to be. It's an impact that in fact affects fundamentally the ability to gather. And, we do live in a society in which being in the same space matters for all sorts of productive activities. So why is it that the economy has done better than we expected it to, and frankly, than a lot of other things have?
Well, first of all, to say that the economy did better than economists forecast in March it's not to say that it's good. It's horrible. So it's just not as horrible as these people who had very little historical precedent to go on.
But it's growing. I mean, it took a huge hit. We lost a lot of jobs, but now we're not at the pace we would want to be. But the economy is growing. We're gaining jobs in the aggregate. Right. I mean, it feels like a really bad recession but a moment in time rather than a
right.
Yeah.
So
I don't
that's
know.
good. That's a good point. So I think there are a couple things. I'm not really sure. One is that it turns out that we're more resilient and adaptable than we thought. That for those of us who are lucky enough to have jobs like the ones we have that can be done remotely, a lot of people did that. And it's not everybody. It's, highly educated people, and it doesn't solve the problem of your kids can't go to school, so you can't work on a computer. And if you were a hotel clerk or an airline flight attendant, there's no way to do that on Zoom. So it's not like it's good for everybody. But I think we adapted. Those of us who could adapted more quickly. Secondly, for reasons I cannot explain, so don't ask me to, the stock market did great.
Yeah.
And that has a couple of effects. One is it meant that for rich people, there was no reason to cut back on spending, but also had huge benefits to state and local revenues. There are a lot of states, California and New York among them, that have very progressive income taxes. And when people were predicting that the state and local sector would be devastating, they were looking at previous recessions. But it turns out this one was very different than previous recessions. This didn't have some as Keynes said, there was some magneto problem. It wasn't a problem in the economic engine. It was this, exogenous shock from the pandemic. We put the economy into a medically induced coma, and it turned out that that some things that we associate with recessions didn't happen. So, for instance, state and local revenues have not fallen nearly as much as you would have expected, given what happened to the unemployment rate. On the other hand, local governments in particular have cut their hiring far more than you would have expected, given what happened to their revenues. So I think basically this is such an unusual situation that predictions were off. But I really want to emphasize, to say that it was better than some economists' forecast does not mean to say it's good. And in particular, the averages look better because of this now cliched K-shaped recovery. For those of us who are working from home, who have good jobs at places like Brookings, our paychecks keep coming. This has been an inconvenience, and it's physically frightening, but not economically devastating. But for lots of people, that's not the case. And for those people, that's why the fiscal support is so important.
Right.
And it gets confused in the averages. And I think there's going to be a big problem for Biden, because if the economy grows at 4 or 5%, and if the unemployment rate comes down, it'll give an argument both to the Republicans and the kind of center-right Democrats in the Senate to say, well, let's wait and see. Let's not do more. And what that means is those of us who are doing okay will continue to do okay, and those of us who aren't are going to continue to suffer, and that's really a tragedy.
So
unnecessary tragedy.
No, so I think that's a great point, and so it kind of leads into my next question, which gets into kind of the checks and Ben's point about how, like, is this not as bad as it was going to be, which is my friend Annie Lowry's book, Give People Money, which is about universal basic income. But we're having, like, in some sense, like, well, this is a very limited and very, very, like, it's even conceived of as exceptional in the nature of the passing of the bills and these like one-offs of like giving this money. But if in fact there was some type of offset of the harm, it comes back in, like, I don't know, that there was an offset in the harm of the recession, or that it could have had, because of that first stimulus check. And then like it kind of, like, let's say like the second stimulus check does the same thing. Do you think that there's any way that universal basic income becomes politically viable under that type of auspices, like in the United States? Like, that seems to be like the only possible environment. Like, saving people's day with the pandemic seems to be a great pitch,
I definitely think there is a UBI element to this whole argument. Those people who are in favor of universal basic income, of course, will use any excuse to let's try it. Let's give people money and see how it works. I think this is a little nerdy, but I think it's important to distinguish between two forms of payment to people. In a time like a recession, you give money to people because you want them to spend it because private demand is weak and the government borrows money and supplements that private demand. And one of the downsides, one of the inefficiencies of giving money to everybody is that some people will save it, and that may be good for them, but it's not the point of counter-cyclical economic policy. That's really quite different than from saying that we've somehow run out of our capacity to provide good paying jobs to people. And we have to find, because, as Andrew Yang said, we're going to automate everybody, a lot of people out of work, we need to give them a stipend every month. I think that's a really different issue.
Yeah.
I'm kind of ambivalent about whether we're there yet. I don't think there's a political consensus for that. But I think that this will be for those people who advocate for universal basic income will say, see, we can do it. And of course, one thing that's, lots of things we've learned in this thing. It turns out that the Treasury can give money to people pretty quickly. Not everybody got their money on time, but Mnuchin claims that the checks are going out, as we speak, the first round of checks. So things have happened. I mean, it's kind of crazy that we can send checks to everybody, but we somehow can't get the state unemployment systems to, tweak the benefits when Congress does it, because they have to find somebody who remembers how to program computers in Fortran.
So I want to ask one of our audience members, Anne, has been asking for a long time for us to focus some attention on the problem of state and local budgets and the circumstance of municipal employees and state employees. It seems like that problem has largely been deferred, and I'm curious for your sense of the politics of it. First of all, I'm bewildered by the politics. It seems to me that if you want state and local governments to continue to provide services, they are not entities unlike the federal government with essentially unlimited borrowing power. They have almost all of them have balanced budget requirements of one sort or another. So the question is really whether the federal government is going to, subsidize the activities of these governments, or whether services are going to decrease.
Absolutely.
And so my question is, I understand that, Republicans in Congress don't like the state government of Illinois and, these sort of pension liability-laden governments. But at the end of the day, they presumably don't want large numbers of unemployed prison guards, teachers. There's a limit to what Congress ought to be willing to tolerate here. And I guess my question is, how do you understand the politics of federal support for state and local governments, and why is it not a relatively easy question?
That's really well put. I have some hypotheses, but I don't really have the answer. So it's always been the case that members of Congress prefer to have the money come from them, and they get credit for it. Purdue and Loeffler can say, we got you $600, and we got you an extra $300 on your unemployment benefit. That's easier for them to say than we gave money to the mayor of Atlanta and the governor of Atlanta and the governor of Georgia. So there's always been that. That doesn't explain the partisan divide. I think you're right that it's really a problem because they can't borrow, because their revenues, though that not down quite as much as people anticipated, are down, because they anticipate their revenues will not go up. They're going to be tightening their belts. And 13% of all workers in the United States work for state and local government. One of the reasons the recovery from the Great Recession was so weak was because state and local governments cut back a lot. And you'd think that with interest rates so low, this would be the time for them to do lots of infrastructure spending at the state and local level, but that didn't happen. So it will be a problem going forward. It'll slow the recovery. It'll mean that they can't provide the services they need to provide. And the issue of the vaccines is a case in point. You have these state health departments, which Lord knows have been strained. The federal government under President Trump says, here, you deal with the vaccines. And some of them really aren't equipped to do it. They don't have the people power and the resources to do it well. And that's why there's so much, consternation. So your question, so I suspect it will happen. After all, it's not like only Democratic states are in trouble. There are plenty of states, you'd think that the Republican governors would be calling Mitch McConnell at midnight and say, get off your butt and do something. Why that hasn't happened, I really don't understand. There is this sub-theme, like we don't want to bail out the states that have these, underfunded pension plans. The pensions may or may not be as big an issue as they say. But the point is, states are not in trouble because they overpaid pensions. States are in trouble because we told them to stop letting restaurants and gyms and highways be used, and that's where they get their money from. I mean, the transit authorities are the worst hit. I mean, there is $15 billion in this new bill for them. That'll save some of them, but do we really want all our subway systems in our big cities to be cutting service because they don't have revenues at a time when we're finally getting serious about climate change? It's just nuts. So bottom line, I suspect it'll happen. I can't explain why the Republicans in Congress were so much against it. There wasn't much effort from the White House or the Treasury to push them in that direction. That will surely change after January 20th.
Can I ask you about the future of state and local government pensions, which already seem to be which have seemed to be like they've been getting less and less kind of popular as time goes on anyways? Do you think that what do you think the role of pensions is going to be anymore in some of these environments after the pandemic?
Well, the pension problems, the states that have promised pensions to people that they can't really afford is a pre-pandemic problem, and it won't get any better because of this. I think there are a couple of things going on. One is that it's really hard for ordinary working people, taxpayers, to accept that state and local workers, in some cases, not all, have better defined benefit pensions than are available to us in the private sector. And so that's going to obviously lead to more political pressure to cut pensions or to make the workers contribute more, or to switch more to 401k style defined contribution plans. And that's happened over time. There's actually been quite a bit of tinkering, and some of it substantial, of pensions in many states. The ones that get talked about are the ones like Illinois and Chicago, which have this huge problem. But in lots of places where the law allows and the state constitution doesn't interfere, they've been gradually ratcheting down. But the other thing, this is something, a point my colleague Louise Shaner has made, kind of conventional wisdom. At times of very low interest rates, this is not as big a problem as the headlines sometimes suggest. Essentially.
Well, that's actually good to know. I'm very interested to hear that.
An unfunded pension plan is a little bit like a debt, right? Mm-hmm. And the interest rate on debt now is very, very low. And so the cost of waiting to shore up your pension plan goes down quite a bit when interest rates are so low. And so what Louise and one of her co-authors, a guy at the Federal Reserve named Byron Lutz, have done is, instead of doing this, let's say how much money do we have to put into the pension fund so that with some reasonable assumption we can assume we can pay things forever, they look at it more like, how long can we go as a pay-as-you-go system before we have a problem? Places which need to address it are ones which run into trouble soon, and places that have a long way to go maybe don't need to worry quite so much. this is not the conventional wisdom, but I think the thinking on the underfunded pension plans among economists has moved a lot more than the political debate on these things, because it's so easy to pillory the things. And believe me, there's some states which are just, Chicago and Illinois are the poster
really
child.
Terrible.
But lots of states and cities are in different positions. It's quite heterogeneous.
So I'm curious, and actually I see Linda has posed this question in the Q&A as well. We've been expecting, people have been saying for a long time that you cannot run up the kind of deficits that we run without generating higher interest rates, without, ultimately without inflation. And yet we kind of cook along in this quite bipartisan fashion. I suppose Democrats are significantly more fiscally conservative than Republicans if you look at like deficit levels by presidential administration, but there are significant deficits in whatever party is in control of whatever institutions of government. And yet interest rates are super low and we don't see inflation, despite, both really loose fiscal policy and really loose monetary policy. And so my question is there something wrong with the way economists have traditionally understood this relationship? And if not, why is the U.S. defying gravity?
So I don't think there's something wrong with the way economists have defined the relationship, but I think the environment has changed a lot. And the biggest change in the environment is this remarkable, steady decline in interest rates over the last 20 years. Not because of the Fed was playing with them, but what economists call the equilibrium rate of interest, the one that prevails theoretically when all is calm, has been coming down for a long time. And that tells you that there's what Ben Bernanke calls a savings glut in the world. There is simply a lot of saving, and there doesn't seem to be demand from private investment to take it up. In a world where interest rates are extraordinarily low, that means that the private sector, hard as it is to believe, is not borrowing as much as it could. So the governments are essentially picking up the slack. And the whole argument about why do we have to worry about the federal debt? What is it that would lead us to think the government debt is a bad thing? Well, the bad reason it's a bad thing is if the government is borrowing a lot of money and it, as economists say, crowds out private investment that might be producing higher living standards in the future, then higher debt and this will retard future growth in living standards. And I think that is true. It will be true someday, but it's not true now. And it's not because of the pandemic. And so I think there's a big rethink going on among economists. I mean, we had this fascinating experience, well, to me, fascinating at the Hutchins Center. We presented a paper by Jason Furman, who Kate referred to, and Larry Summers, that was basically setting forth their economic argument for why we don't have to worry about the debt anytime soon because interest rates are so low. And I was searching for someone to say you're full of it. I invited Ben Bernanke because I thought he'd be more conservative than they are. He kind of basically agreed with them. And I invited Ken Rogoff, who was the guy who was famous for saying the world would end when we got to 90% debt to GDP ratio, which we sailed right through. And he said, yeah, well, I kind of agree with them too.
What about Greg Mankiw? Sorry.
There's some, but you can feel the center of gravity among economists saying the environment is different. This steady decline in market interest rates has lasted longer than we expected. And at times like this, it means that you can borrow more safely. And so we've run the experiment. It's not just the United States. It's true everywhere around the world. Japan didn't collapse either, and they've borrowed a ton. It's not necessarily a great position to be in. Having really low interest rates means that there's not demand for investment. It makes it really hard to get economies moving again, which is why one of the reasons we're struggling now. But as long as interest rates are very low, the federal government is borrowing at less than the rate of inflation. There's really little reason to like wring your hands and say the world's going to collapse on Friday unless we do some deficit reduction. What Larry Summers would say here is that if not for all these things going on, interest rates would be even lower. That it's not that federal borrowing doesn't push up interest rates, it's that the forces that are pushing down interest rates are so much stronger, whether it's demographics or a stage of technology or whatever, that it's not showing up.
So would you say, given that the right way to think about the deficit is just in reference to the cost of the additional debt liability, the cost of carrying the additional debt liability against the return on the investment that you're going to make with the spending?
Yes. I mean, basically, if the federal government can borrow, you can borrow 10-year money now for 0.9%. The federal government can borrow for 30 years at less than the rate of inflation. So if you have investments, whether it's in rural broadband or healthcare and education for low-income kids, where we know there is a strong return, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to do that. And that's why when I think that some of the angst about the $2,000 check is, if I have $500 billion to spend, maybe I'd be better off doing it on those things like that would pay off in the future, even though some people really could use the money now. So yes, absolutely. And I think that's the case that the Biden people will make for what is sure to be a proposal for a big public investment program. Now, how they get that through the Senate, I don't know. But, everybody's favorite topic, our colleague Bill Galston and among others, if the one thing that they might be able to do on a bipartisan basis is infrastructure, even though it's been infrastructure week for the last 3.5 years.
Sorry, that was pretty good. Yes, it has been infrastructure week for the last 3.5 years. And infrastructure keeps changing. Like it's either like getting the last mile of like fiber optic cable to people's houses, or it's fixing bridges, or it's it's everything.
Right.
So,
and I think that a better frame is public investment, and there is now substantial evidence that things like pre-K and healthcare for low-income kids and stuff like that pay off for them in higher wages and pay off for the society in ways that the proponents always said they did, but the evidence was kind of thin. It's much stronger now. There was in one of the economic journals, one of these couple of Harvard economists did this, summed up 120 experiments and research papers and showed it. So in a way, it's important, I think, not in a way, it's very important that when we talk about public investment, we don't always think about building another lane on the I-95.
Yeah.
No, I think about that a lot. Especially when I look at my eminent domain, kind of a lot of the work I do in that area. But so this is kind of a little bit off topic. We're going to switch to questions in a second. So I thought kind of we would have a moment for me to kind of pose this to you. It's been going around in a lot of the libertarian economic circles that I kind of follow on Twitter. And it's a conversation about why the vaccines, no section of the vaccine like cash has been put up for auction. And basically the idea that if you auction vaccines in some way that like people could bid on them, and that you would have essential workers like janitors at a hospital
put up to auction to individuals or
yes,
to
like
states?
Individuals would have essential workers could then some percentage of. I know there's like a huge dignity problem. How about
a huge practical problem? So if you're a hedge fund manager, you can bid up the price, and if you're a janitor, you can't get it?
No. It's like a janitor at a hospital basically has access to the vaccine because they're high in the order to get it, but they would rather quit their job as a janitor and not work as a janitor at all and pay to sell the vaccine and not get it, and like that they could then be at home with their family and not be at risk at all.
Who's
and sell
advocating
their
for
vaccine
this?
to a hedge fund manager. Really, you've never? This is such like kind of like dark libertarian kind of like anti-dignity, like kind of using the market type of thinking. But
I mean, it does sound like a bloodless Richard Posner idea about selling babies.
No, it's like the paying so you don't have to go into the military. You pay someone else to go in, and they gladly. I think it's crazy.
No, it's actually it's a little bit the opposite. Let's say that you're an essential worker and you're like a registered nurse or something, and you're making $40,000 a year, $60,000 a year, and you would have access to the vaccine first, like in the first month, and you sell your dose to a hedge fund manager for $100,000, and you get to not work for the entire year. And doesn't
seem like a great solution to, especially with shortage of nurses.
I do not understand. I also don't understand why this has cachet with people, which is why I'm asking the question.
No, well, look, there are people who think that the market is the best way to allocate everything, and so there's always been this fascinating argument about organ transplants.
Yes,
and should you be able to sell your kidney?
It's the same people that argue for organ transplants.
I think it's I think it's a terrible idea.
Yeah, I agree. I mean,
I think we should. First of all, it's outrageous that we can't. For all the time we had in developing the vaccine and the success they've had in the science, that we seem to have such difficulty in distributing it and getting into people's arms. Seems crazy to me, and I think that's going to be a big challenge to the Biden administration. We ought to be able to do this better and have enough so that we can give the hedge fund manager a shot as well as the nurse. I personally would like one myself.
Yep.
All right, totally. Esther, you get the first question today.
Oh, hi everybody. Hi, this is actually on behalf of my husband, who walks around the house mumbling, "I don't understand why the stock market is so high when so many people are in economic trouble." So I told him I would post the question. And I think you said earlier, don't ask me why. But anyway, it was already posted and voted on. So yeah, it just keeps going up, and the average person on Main Street isn't with it. So I guess looking from a Main Street perspective, what do you have to say?
Well, look, there are a couple of possibilities. One is the market is just way optimistic about what's going to happen with the vaccine, and we're going to get back to normal faster than a lot of us think. So that's one possibility. The second possibility is that people who have money are putting money in the stock market because there's so few places where you can get a decent interest rate. With, as I said, the other side of government bonds being at the government paying 0.9% to borrow money is that's not very appealing. You'd rather put the money in the stock market. Yeah. Maybe you lose it.
Also, why real estate's going crazy.
Right. And the third answer I usually give to that question is the market is completely nuts and it's going to end. And you can decide which one of those three explanations holds the most water. So either the market's uber optimistic. Second, it's because the Fed and other interest rates are so low, there's nowhere else to put money if you have it. And third is we're just about to fall off the cliff. So whatever happens, I'm covered.
David Botts, the floor is yours. Except that, there you are.
We need to ask. Hello. Is that Lloyd?
This is Luke.
Luke the cat. And let's take a look at your background.
Oh, Beanie Baby.
Who's the teddy bear?
It's related to my Beanie Baby tweet.
So, I thought about taking Kate's advice and investing in Beanie Babies, because I can't put it in. I can't.
They're the baseball cards of the 90s.
Yes. I made a joke on Twitter. On Twitter, David, that I basically was like, I have all of this money that I accidentally threw into Bitcoin and it's doing great. But really, is this just like, should I sell it now? Is it like Beanie Babies, or can I get rid of, like, what should I do with this? So anyways, that's what.
So
David's
my question
background.
is, do you have to have a cat or a dog in your lap to ask a question on this show?
No, it's just that we're known to be friendly to
pets and
to
children.
pets because Kate sometimes brings a live cormorant or a giant sea turtle. Kate rescues animals despite her apparent interest in auctioning off vaccines. She's
And
actually a softie who rescues animals, and so people feel like it's a cool thing to bring their furry friends on the show. David, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I'm wondering, can you please comment on the economic costs and benefits related to immigration? And really on a related question, are there studies or analysis of the economic impact in the U.S. of the removal of over 300,000 people due to death as being both producers and consumers? What does that mean for the economy to lose all of these people?
So wait, can I just clarify what you're asking here? Is your point that immigration adds people to the economy and that has pros and cons, and COVID removes people from the economy and that has presumably negative consequences? Or
100%.
Okay.
Good question.
More people of a non-birthed variety and versus fewer people. What do we know about what the impacts of increasing the population through immigration or decreasing it through disease are?
Well, it seems like a pretty bad way to operate to think about the economic pros and cons of 300,000 people dying. But let's think about it. So those are people who, many of whom had unused productive years of life left. And in fact, there's quite a bit of concern that people who got COVID and survived but are not fully recovered, they'll be less productive, they'll have lower incomes, they'll contribute less to society. So unless you're in some zero population growth Malthusian world, I don't see any great upside to having a whole lot of people die in an economic sense. And that's before you even get to the human things about losing your mom or dad or daughter or cousin. I don't think that we're at a point in our economic history where we have too many people. And that goes to one of the reasons the immigration thing is so interesting is that we are an aging society, because not only people are living longer, but women are tending to have fewer kids on average than they used to. And that means the labor force will be growing more slowly. And that means the overall rate of growth will be slower because we have fewer immigrants. And there's also substantial evidence that some of those immigrants turn out to be superstars in the economy. Mm-hmm. And we will lose the benefit of those superstars. You know, the student who might have come to the United States to get a PhD, and if we were not idiots, we would let her stay in the United States and work in a software lab or a biotech lab somewhere in the U.S. If those people don't come, we'll not get the benefits of their productivity over their lifetimes. Maybe someone else will get it, Canada or Australia or something. So, I mean, there is quite a bit of, as you know, debate about the economic effects of immigration. And there are those people who say that if you bring a lot of low-skilled immigrants to the United States, they compete with low-skilled native-born people, and that reduces their wages. My reading of the evidence is there's a lot less of that than you would think. And on balance, immigration has been an economic plus. Jason Furman, who Kate mentioned earlier, has an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal today in which he says that on balance, Trump pumped a lot of money into the economy pre-pandemic, so that's been an economic plus, but it's been offset by the minus of severely restricting immigration, which he reads as an economic contributor.
Yeah, I don't understand the argument, I mean, I've never studied it carefully, but it seems to me if you look at the major difference between Japan and the United States economically over the last 25, 30 years, right? We were peer economies. They were supposed to overtake us on a per capita basis in the 80s, and we were all terrified of Japan. What's the difference between Japanese economic performance and ours? We're both aging. And the answer is the United States has an immense amount of immigration that replenishes a workforce that the Japanese don't have. I can't imagine the United States being as vibrant economically as it is without a influx of adult workforce of a type that I don't see how we get without immigration.
So I think there's probably other differences between Japan and the U.S. than that. But sure. Your basic point is right. I think that, to my mind, a lot of the debate about immigration in the United States is not really economic.
Right.
It's about culture and race and identity, and people who have, particularly some white people who've had a pretty hard time economically over the last generation, are threatened by the number of Spanish speakers in their community or the number of people with dark skins, and that before Trump, it was not socially acceptable to argue about them on racial grounds, so you resorted to economics. Trump liberated that, so now we can just say we don't want the other. I think it's tragic. My mom is a German Jewish refugee who came to the United States, fleeing Hitler's Germany. Her family was adopted by a small town in Illinois, a church in a small town of Illinois. She went on to raise 4 kids in the United States, all of whom are, if you count me, very productive members of society. So I think that the thing that I find so uncomfortable about this argument is that so many Americans in recent, 1 or 2 generations back are children of immigrants, and yet that somehow gets lost. It's the old story about once you get in the lifeboat, you want to pull up the ladder. So I think it's very sad. And I think that I suspect that whether Biden can fix the immigration system and get the right balance between who we let in and who we don't and how to police the borders is an open question. But I have no doubt that the tone will be far different than the one we've had to suffer through for the last 4 years.
Mike Godwin, the floor is yours, sir.
Hi, I hope you can hear me okay. I just had a system crash. Great.
We're good.
Great. I recovered quickly. So my question is really about what struck me about the debate over stimulus checks that's in this last round was that the debate was not yes or no, but the debate was over the amount. And I wondered doesn't this really sort of imply that everyone at least tacitly recognizes that that physical therapists are needed a lot of the time to keep an economy moving. It seems to me odd that if you recognize that putting money in people's pockets has some positive stimulus on the economy, why draw the line at $600 or why at $2,000 for that matter, rather than a UBI? So my question is, was Nixon right? Are we all finally now really Keynesians?
So just to go to, I don't remember, the $600 checks weren't in the original compromise. That came because people pushed for it. And I think some of the argument is, let's target the money at people who really need it. So why cut the amount of money you put into unemployment benefits and put it instead to checks, other than it's popular to send everybody a check? So I think the answer to your Keynesian question is yes, 100%. I mean, if we've learned anything in the past year, it's that when there's a collapse of private demand, in this case, one ordered by the government as a result of a pandemic.
Wait, do you mean like lockdown?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. public spending can keep an economy from collapsing. We learned that a lot, some of that in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act after the Great Recession. So Keynes is alive and well. He was in hibernation for a while, but he's back.
Okay. Just like a question, like the government lockdown question of not going out to physical places and spending money didn't stop people from buying money privately on their computers and having it sent to them via like various like kind of, you know, logistical mechanisms. So there was kind of, do you think that was as true now as it was in a pre-internet age? Like when Nixon said it? I guess is basically.
But look, what happened was demand after the shock of the thing, demand for goods kind of persisted. What made this recession so different is that demand for services, in-person services, collapsed. So it's pretty hard to get a manicure over the internet, and people.
You don't know my internet, but sure.
Well, if maybe those libertarians who are polluting your Twitter feed can show you how to. The whole question of business travel and tourism, that didn't. So yes, we gave money to a lot of people, and a lot of them spent it, and that's why the economy isn't in worse shape. Home sales and auto sales are actually doing surprisingly well. Right. A lot of people are renovating their houses and so they're spending money on some things. But the demand for services fell. And I think some of the argument is, and it wasn't only because the government told people not to go out. People were afraid because of the pandemic. And so there's really interesting work, even in places where the government didn't order people to close their shops. There were many fewer people going out. So, but I think there's a really different what Keynes said is when private demand is weak, the governments could step in. Keynes did not argue for UBI, that you always need the federal government handing out checks for people who don't work.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Tom McGuckin.
Hi, Tom.
The floor is yours. I like the bottles.
Okay.
It really makes a statement.
Actually, I was having a late lunch. The alcohol wasn't included. I would pull that up for this show. Listen, David, I'm an economist, or I'm actually retired now, but I was on a pension board for years as a trustee. I have a lot of thoughts, but just to keep to my focused question, one of the things that I heard on Bloomberg today was that the stock market rose in value $5 trillion over 2020. And it just seems to me that there's a coming reckoning in income, wealth distribution. Wealth distribution. Now, as a pension board person, actually the stock market rising has helped the pension board. You talk about underfunded pensions. Well, we have a lot of our assets in equities, right. So it's been a good year for that. But I'm just talking about the COVID wealth distribution effect. Okay. And it just strikes me that the household balance sheets have gone to hell. But a lot of really, I admit pensions are actually teachers. But I mean, do you have any thoughts about the wealth distribution effects of this whole mess?
Yeah. I mean, basically, we were on a pretty bad trajectory from my point of view before the pandemic, and the pandemic just made it worse. And so I think that both the distribution of income and wealth has widened, and it gets to the point where it tears at the social fabric. And I think that it's frustrating that there's some reluctance in Washington to address it. We know there are a couple ways to do it. One is you can redistribute wealth, take money, raise taxes at the top and give it to people at the bottom. And the other way to do it is to invest in those things which increase the wealth of people at the bottom in order to close the gap. There seem to be lots of forces in our economy that are driving a huge gulf between winners and losers. And government policy tends to restrain that, but the restraints haven't gotten more aggressive as the market forces have widened. So yes, very much. And I think, there's been quite a bit of talk about the racial wealth gap and the just the appalling difference in home ownership between whites and blacks, the average wealth of whites and blacks who have similar education. So I think the gaps between places in the country that are prospering and places that aren't. So I think it's a huge problem. I think we don't really have the ultimate solutions, but there are things we could do to minimize the problem. And I think there'll be increasing discussion of that, because I think that the pandemic has shined a very bright spotlight on these inequities.
Alice Mercer, you get the last question today.
Hi, Alice.
Hi, I'm wearing my hat.
You look great.
We're
Thanks.
pro hat.
Oh, overalls too.
Nice.
I'm all
For some
dressed
reason, I
up.
can't hear her question.
Oh, okay.
So
I will
you
read
to
it.
translate.
I will
I have an error
reframe it for
message
you.
that says unable to subscribe to a stream in a reasonable amount of time, which I've never
Weird.
seen.
Interesting.
Okay.
Well, we will, Alice will pose her question and we will
Okay.
repeat it.
Okay, so I had to ask a question. I think we've kind of gone around it, which was Larry Summers' comment over on the $2,000 for stimulus would overheat the economy.
Okay.
That's it.
Go ahead, Ben.
So, yeah, Alice asks about Larry Summers' skepticism about the $2,000 magnitude of the checks.
Yeah.
Can you, first of all, describe his position and, secondly, evaluate it? You said you think there's a reasonable debate to be had about 2,000 versus 600.
All right. So, first of all, I don't want to be in the position of being Larry Summers' defense attorney. I don't get paid nearly enough.
That's okay.
For that.
The entire chat now thinks that I'm this crazy libertarian because I posed that question. So, you're great. Don't worry about it.
I don't. I think there's a case to be made that the $2,000 check was not the best use of the money. I think Larry made it almost as if he wanted to be more provocative than he usually is, and to suggest that we're going to overheat the economy by giving people money at a time when he's been arguing that the economy is like permanently underheated in a period of secular stagnation was a bit jarring. So Larry's position is that when you look at the overall amount of consumer income in the United States, and the gap between that and where it was before the pandemic, $2,000 per person. And because of the way that particular bill was written, it would have gone, some money would have gone all the way up to people who make a little over $100,000, was basically too much. And it would more than replace the lost income, and that was like a bad idea. That's basically Larry's thing. What I would say is, I think the stimulus bill isn't big enough. And if I could get political consensus to do that, rather than something I prefer, I might have gone along with it. But my starting point would be, if you want to spend another $500 billion, I think there are better ways to spend it than sending checks blindly, both to people who need it and those who don't.
So that actually brings us to a great kind of like wrapping point, which what would you, if you, in 2 months, the economy looks roughly the same way that it does now, do you have like an idea of like what you would want the federal government to do in that situation?
What would the phase 3 bill look like if they called you and said, write it for us?
Well, I'm happy to answer that question because there's no chance that's going to happen.
Way better than my auction question.
No consequences. So I would set up this auction system so people could sell their right to get a vaccine.
For organs.
And, why not third-born children? Who needs third children, right? Look, I think I would do a couple things. One is, I do think state and local governments need a lot of money, and they need a lot of money not only because they lost revenues, but because a lot of the demands that we put on them are not being met. So, like why not have every public school in America have use this as an opportunity to fix their ventilation system, get testing, make sure that every school has the same benefits that the well-heeled schools may. I would definitely take it. I would think we've learned a lot. So I never quite knew what to make about all this rural broadband stuff, but when you see these pictures of these kids sitting on the steps of the public
that's
library,
a terrible thing.
That's
God. You have to get kids broadband.
That's we could do that.
Yes.
I would think about what have we learned about our public health system, and how can we shore it up, because surely we're going to have another pandemic, and I'd like to see us make different mistakes the next time. I think that also the unemployment insurance is a great program because it really does direct money to the people who are hit when the economy tanks. But the whole reason that we gave a flat sum of X dollars to people on unemployment rather than, say, doing on a percentage basis is because the state systems couldn't handle it. So this is ridiculous. We need to have a much better unemployment insurance system. I would build into the thing and all sorts of automatic things so that if the economy turns worse, the money would flow automatically rather than waiting for Congress to get around to do it. And I would use this as an opportunity for a very large public investment program in both services for low-income kids and for climate change and other things that we know we're going to have to do, and we should do them now when interest rates are really low, because they may not be low forever.
Oh my God, I love that idea. That is I think that's a brilliant idea. I really hope that the administration takes that up, because I do completely agree that the interest rates right now are so conducive, and it's almost it almost reminds me of not the same thing as the WPA or something like the Tennessee Valley Authority or something like that, but they're the interest rates are so low, you could build so much infrastructure and create kind of a legacy for that in the future. And it would be really powerful.
I have to say, I really think the concept of talking about it as public investment rather than as infrastructure is a really useful one, because when people hear infrastructure, they think bridges and roads, and it's not like we don't have bridges and roads to build. But if you ask me what are the 10 most important infrastructure projects you could
the rural broadband
would be, as somebody who has to run this show from rural Virginia sometimes, I wouldn't say that's worth a public investment to make in lieu of fun happen. But, there are kids in that area who don't have access to decent internet for purposes of all kinds of educational purposes too.
Completely. Yeah.
All right, we got a break. We have a poll up for you all on your favorite forms of fiscal stimulus. Ann Kay will be delighted that relief to state and local governments is right now running away with it. If you want to ruin Ann's day, just go into the poll.
So pleased.
And vote against, vote for direct payments to individuals, just to screw up all our, all our high-minded talk here. We will be back tomorrow with the incredibly long-delayed Lisa Page. And Lisa will actually, for those of you who have been long time in lieu of fun watchers, we will actually tell the story of how the first Lisa Page show got canceled and how the Lisa Page puppet was created. David Wessel, what a pleasure. It's great to see your face and hear your voice. And thank you for coming on.
David,
I enjoyed it.
Wonderful to meet you. Thank you for taking my questions, stupid or intelligent.
Well, I enjoyed it, and now that I've mastered how to get my camera working on Crowdcast, I'm happy to do it again sometime.
Great.
Yeah, let's do it again soon.
That would be great. That would be super great.
We will be back 22 hours and 53 minutes from now, and until then, Kate,
we don't have fun anymore. But at the very least, people, we could find a way to sell our organs online.
Yeah, that's right. eBay, OregonEBay.com, run by Kate. See you guys tomorrow.
Bye.
Bye.